Okay, we're going to tie a woolly sculpin. This is a pattern that's made much better by the addition of a fish skull sculpin helmet, a nice molded piece of metal that helps get this fly down to the bottom and keep it down there. The hook I like to use for this is a 37-187 Mustad hook. They're getting hard to come by, but you could still get them out there on eBay and other sites like that, and a lot of shops still have them on hand. But you can use a hook that doesn't have quite as wide a gap as this. Now, I'm using a regular Zonka strip here, and I've just measured about 1.5 the length of the shank, and I'm cutting the back end of the strip off in a point. I can't give you a really good reason for doing that. It's just that's the way I've done it for years, so I keep doing it. And I'm just measuring here to make sure I've got about 3/4 to 7/8 of the shank length in Zonka strip here. Then I lay it right on the hook point, right in line with the hook point, and just poke it through. And then remove the hook from the vise and slide this up around towards the eye. And to keep all the hair from messing with me while I'm trying to put this hook back in the vise, I just push that Zonka strip all the way to the front so that I've got a clear bend area to work with. And now I'll pull this all the way back, and I like to wet this hair and stroke it out away from the Zonka strip, and then squeeze the Zonka strip really tightly in my fingers when I push it down around the bend, so that it stays out of my way, kind of stays in place back here on the bend. Good tight squeeze and get that nice and wet, and it'll pretty much stay there through the rest of the fly. I like to start my hook just a little bit in front of the halfway point, or start my thread, excuse me. I'm about halfway down the shank here. Cut that tag end off. I like to wrap to the back and then back to the midpoint and put in my ribbing material, in this case black copper wire. I'll pull the end of that in, get that up on the bottom of the hook, and then wrap all the way to the bend where I ended my thread wraps and wrap back to the middle. And I've got red wool here, and I'm going to build an underbody with red wool. I'm just going to attach this on and then get some Zap-A-Gap gel to make sure this wool will grab to the hook and not spin. I don't want this to be loose on the shank at all. I want the body to be well attached to the shank. So I've got that red wool on, and I'm just going to throw a whip finish in there, and then bring my bobbin cradle into play and let that bobbin hang out over that, and get my Zap-A-Gap gel. I like to put a goodly amount of this right on the hook shank, top and bottom. Put that away, and then grab this red wool and just wrap towards the bend. Back up and then go back towards the bend, and doing these extra layers in this front portion of this underbody will give me the taper that I want. I want a fairly thick, stout body on this fly. Sculpins are very bulky in the front end and taper aggressively towards the rear. Let me get that bobbin cradle out of the way. I'll make a few loose wraps over the top of this wool body that I've formed. Get to the back here and tie off this red wool. Cut that tag off. Then wrap back to the front again. I'm going to tie that tag down, get to the front, and do a whip finish knot like I did before, but instead of hanging out over the bobbin cradle, this time I'm going to cut the thread right off. And then coat this whole underbody with head cement. I'm using head cement on this section of the fly because the head cement takes a little longer to harden up and dry, and that lets me get my uni mohair started on the front of this, pulling it really tight and then wrapping back over that head cement that's still wet. Now wrap to the back, then turn around and wrap back towards the eye. And what I'm going to do when I get up to the eye, you'll see that this material is pretty slippery, one of the reasons for the cement. And see how it wants to slide down off like that? I'm going to wrap back and I'll hold that in place, then wrap down to the front, pull it tight. And I'm not worried about that slipping later because you'll see there's plenty to hold it in place. So I'm just going to restart my thread, wrap around the tag end. Make a couple of locking wraps here and then cut that tag end of the thread and the tag end of the uni mohair off as well. Now you see some of what keeps that the body in place. I'm going to bring this zonker strip down, tuck it tightly up against the back of the body. Wet those hairs and stroke them to the back. You can see how that zonker strip forms down over the face of the body where it wanted to, that material wanted to slide. So I'm going to wrap this tightly down here. Let me push on it here a little bit with my thumb and get it snug. Make sure that's well seated in there by pushing down tightly on it. And secure it and trim off this front portion. A few wraps to tighten that down. I'm just going to let my bobbin hang while I wrap this rib material up. Now's a good time to check and make sure that that Sculpin helmet is going to fit, and I've got plenty of room. So slide that back off. And again, stroke this hair, wet it a little bit, get it out of the way. I want to make a double wrap back here to hold this zonker strip in place. My first wrap of wire. I'm using a medium grade wire here, although I could get away with a smaller wire, I suppose, but I like to use the heavier wire. I think it just makes the fly that much more durable. Can't quite seem to get that to lay right beside the other wrap. Something won't go where you want it to go, just push it around. Get my fingernail in there. There. So there's two good tight wraps on the tail end of the zonker strip. Kind of stroke some of that hair out of the way and let me get a bodkin. Help me guide this wire through the hair. I like to use the rotation of the vise to do this because I like to pull the wire through the hair from the back side towards me. Over the top. You can watch right where it's going, make sure I haven't pulled my zonker strip out of alignment, and again take my bodkin needle and just poke that, and there comes my wire up through again. And you just keep doing that all the way to the front. You can see this wire and the zonker strip, between the two of them, they're going to hold that body material that has a tendency to slip. They're going to hold it right in place, plus that cement has hardened up now. the head cement that I put on the red underbody. Now just unwrap the 6 or 7 wraps that built up while I was wrapping the rib. Tie that rib material off. Get in here and pinch that wire and just helicopter it off. Now with that done, I like to pick out the mohair on the bottom side of this fly. Now's the best time and easiest time to get at that hair. And then take the wool that are going to become the pectoral fins on this. And this is wool on the skin, and I'm just combing out the hairs, get all the tangles out of it that I can. And just now rolled it over, and I'm cutting it away from the skin. And there's the clump that I combed out, and you can see the dye job isn't the best. The bottom here that I'm getting the rest of the underfur out of with a comb. The bottom is a little bit different tone than the tips, and I like to take advantage of that by just separating these 2 clumps and turning them over end for end. Now I've got a mixture of hair coloration and discoloration, if you will. I'll take that clump, that's the size I want to use for this side. If I twist it, you can see twisted tight, it's about the size of the head that I've got to tie it onto. You can use felted wool for this. You don't have to have wool that's on the skin like I had. Felted wool works perfectly fine. You just pull some off and arrange it just like I did here, about the same size clump as far as thickness. You won't have the length, but the thickness would be just fine. I've got a second clump here. I've prepared it by splitting it and turning it end for end. This one's a little bigger. This is about as big as you'd want to go for a clump. And you just tie this on by wrapping over the middle of it. And that's pretty much the look you want, is a great big bunch sticking out in the front and the back on both sides. I'm going to eventually stroke all of this to the rear and fit that Sculpin helmet right on over the wool. Wrap all those ends down. Make sure we got a good solid base to put the Zap-A-Gap gel that's going to hold that Sculpin helmet in place. I'll just do a whip finish now and cut this bobbin and thread right off, because everything now is pretty much just super glue and the Sculpin helmet. Check and make sure it's still going to fit. If it doesn't, I've got to take and reset that wool, but I've got plenty of room. Pull these pieces down. Make sure I've got them pretty well aligned. It's all going to fit nicely, it looks like. So I'll pull it off and get my Zap-A-Gap gel again. You want to put a goodly amount on here, enough to fill the voids and grab that helmet, but you don't want so much that it squeezes out all over the place. It's just, you have to kind of get used to the right amount. Kind of a messy job there, so I'll spread that out a bit with my bodkin needle. Bring that Sculpin helmet in and slide it into place. And you have to hold some pressure on this while this is drying. I like to turn it over and make sure everything's aligned. Pull those pectoral fins, if you will, down into place, and now I'm just pushing tightly against this helmet to hold it in place while that super glue hardens. And this is why you don't want to use too much, because if any squeezes out and you get it between your finger and that Sculpin helmet, you will glue yourself to the helmet. That's all hardened. I'll start with some rust-colored thread, not for any other reason than I just want to put a different color on the front of this than the olive and brown that's been in it. And rust is a good generic color, if you will, but it gives it a little bit of a hot spot or a different color in the nose. Tie that off. Cut it off and put a little head cement on there. Turn this over and make sure the head cement went around to the bottom, and it did. So now it's time to trim those pectoral fins. Stroke all this stuff up, and I've got a pair of curved scissors here that help quite a bit instead of my regular straight scissors. Now roll that over and try to cut the other side the same length. This is a big advantage to a rotary vise right here, being able to turn these into the position that's comfortable for your hands, and the position of your hands when you're doing this cutting. I'll just round those up a little bit more. And these are very big, very thick. There's so much wool in here right now that when this hits the water, it's going to float. And I'm going to trim these down later. This is about as big and as thick. When I get done cutting on this, this is about as big and thick as you want to leave this wool pectoral fin. It's actually bigger than I normally leave them, and like I said, I'll trim this down a little bit more later on. I just want you to see the size that you can get out of this clump of wool that you tied in on both sides here. It's time for the eyes. Again, a little zap-a-gap. Don't need very much. Use the point of your bodkin or a razor knife or something to get underneath that eye and bring it up and get it placed. And seat it with your thumbnail. And do the same thing for the second eye. If you're good, you can do both eyes and put the super glue in both spots and place those eyes before that super glue dries, but I never quite dare to do it. I always do one at a time. And with that in place, you pretty much have a wool head sculpin or a woolly sculpin. And like I said, when you throw that in the water, it will float or tend to float with that much wool on it. But once it gets wet, that wool holds the water, and it will sink very readily after the initial soaking. But cutting these pectoral fins down a little bit sure doesn't hurt a thing. They'll still stick out quite nicely once this is in the water and you're pulling it through the water. You'll see those pectoral fins stay right out there, but that wool is soft enough so it does allow them to move. The pectoral fins do pulse when you pull this through the water. Shave that down just a little bit more. You can see these are much smaller than what they were when I initially tied them in. But there you have it. There's a woolly sculpin tied with a skull head Sculpin helmet, and it's tied using rotary fly tying techniques.